Well, hi, class is in session here once again at the virtual campus of the Apartment Academy, your operations-focused podcast here in the multifamily industry and your institute for higher NOI. I'm your host, the Dean of the Apartment Academy, Daniel Cunningham. Today's lecture was with Russell Leavitt, who is the executive chairman of a company called Telgian that is really a fire safety, overall risk management consultant, heavy emphasis on fire safety. And Russell had some interesting things to say about some of the most common mistakes that operators make and that leave them exposed to fire loss. And I think it's an episode that anyone who's operating apartment buildings should listen to very closely. Here is Professor Leavitt. Professor Leavitt, welcome to Lecture Hall 101 here at the stately Apartment Academy. Glad to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Russell, you are the executive chairman at Telgian. Tell us a little bit about what Telgian does.
Telgian actually is involved with a couple of different operations or organizations. Our founding roots were based around engineering and consulting related to fire risk. And the company was actually founded by two retired fire prevention officers from the city of San Diego, along with myself. And my background actually came from suppression. So I was a systems designer originally around fire sprinkler systems, fire alarm systems and such. And then we had another gentleman whose background was also related to fire suppression. And then the fifth founder was the son of one of the fire prevention officers whose background was really business and those sorts of things. The five of us were all living in the city of San Diego at the time. We got together. And the focus was really on helping owners of properties, whether it was existing properties or new development, to help them navigate through all of the requirements that come from the codes and standards, along with practices that could help the owner basically get the best return on their investment. And so we saw ourselves as advocates for the owner, because when you look at all of the different things that are required by law, regulation, insurance, all the other stakeholders that are involved with this, sometimes it was always easy to spend the owner's money without really looking at what was the owner of the property getting back from that. So that was really our founding focus, was to be an advocate for the owner.
And how long ago did Telgian start?
We all got together in 1990. So it was 1990, so we've been together over 30 years now, although only myself and one other of the original founders are still active in the company. The rest have retired and such.
And what is the what's the size of the multifamily client list that you have there? Is it a heavy multifamily concentration? You do commercial as well?
Actually, our biggest concentration is commercial, but we do have a large multifamily portfolio, and I've been deeply involved in the whole standards and codes making process that affected multifamily. So a strong background in helping determine what the best requirements are to get the best protection for multifamily dwellings.
Great, perfect. This is an area that a lot of, I think, apartment operators don't really fully understand. Obviously, they know they have to have fire inspections. They know they've got fire sprinkler systems, but some of the nuance is probably lost to them sometimes. So this is going to be a great topic. Russell, maybe kick us off talking about, just generally speaking, what do multifamily operators need to be thinking about when it comes to reducing their risk and exposure to fire loss?
Well, I think, like anything else, the number one issue is maintenance. Um, what we know is that regardless of whether it's an engineered system like sprinkler systems or alarm systems, or things such as keeping exit corridors or outdoor corridors clear and free and accessible, just the everyday maintenance, because we know that when we look at fire sprinkler systems, for example, um, we know that 80% of the failures that occur, and when I say failure, I mean we have a fire where we would expect a sprinkler to operate and control the fire. And that does not happen 80% of the time. When that fails to happen, it was directly related to maintenance. And believe it or not, 2/3 of those failures are that we simply had turned off a valve. There was no water supply. And so when you think about it, if as an owner, I just make sure that for my sprinkler system, for example, that my water supply is on, my valve is on, I can lower my failure rate by 2/3. And that, there's nothing much more simple than doing that. But to be honest, most apartment owners don't even understand how the system works. And that's been one of the things that we've tried to do, is just educate and understand, help owners understand how simple some of these things are.
And why do you suppose there is that gap in sort of understanding how their fire systems work? These are complicated systems, or do they just not take the time to learn about them? Like, well, how do you fix that problem, that knowledge gap?
Well, I think when it comes to, for instance, let's look at sprinkler systems versus alarm systems. So alarm systems are designed purely for life safety. So if I have a smoke alarm activate, or somebody does operates a pool station, or some other alarm takes place, it's designed to alert the occupants, hey, something's gone wrong. We need to get out of the building, right, or out of the apartment, or such. And these systems, if they have a problem, they create a nuisance. And so owners tend to react or respond because we don't want to have a smoke alarm that is activating when there's no smoke or fire and such. And so they tend to do something about those systems. The suppression systems, like a sprinkler system, are passive from the standpoint they just sit there, and they only activate when a fire occurs. And so they're easy to ignore. They're easy to. I can tell you that many owners don't even realize that they have a sprinkler system in some cases. I mean, they see the devices in the ceiling or whatever, but they really don't understand what they are. And then there is the fear or the misunderstanding that, well, do I really want a sprinkler system to operate because it's going to flood my building? Because we watch television, movies and things, and the miscommunication, the misunderstanding there is that if I have a fire, all of the sprinklers in my building are going to operate, which is not true. The only sprinklers that will operate are those that are exposed to heat. So 80% of the fires that occur in a sprinklered building, only 1 or 2 sprinklers activate and control the fire. So I think a lot of it is they just don't realize these systems are there to begin with.
Yeah, well, that's slightly hilarious, but maybe more terrifying.
It's both, yes.
Yeah. And so, what do you recommend in terms of a best practice for ongoing maintenance and prevention of things like valves that are not turned on? How do people keep that? Because part of the problem on the multifamily side, and maybe commercial as well, is that there's so much turnover, Russell. So one guy knows about the valve, he's gone 18 months, the next guy doesn't know. How do you create institutional knowledge and consistency around these things?
That is the challenge. And the turnover, you are absolutely correct about that. And so at some level, if you have apartments, for instance, that are owned by a oversight company or a landlord that is fairly constant, that knowledge needs to reside there so that when a new manager comes in or a new person responsible for the facility, this knowledge can be passed along, or this understanding can be a simple checklist, to say, hey, these are the systems that you have. This is where the control valves are located, and this is what you should do monthly or quarterly or annually to make sure that they're operating.
And is that one of the deliverables if somebody engages with Telgian? Is that that series of checklists and documentation?
Yes, we can supply the checklist. We can supply the way these things can be documented. The standards that are written for keeping these systems operable are geared to allow many of the tasks to be done by the owner or an owner's representative, because we know that if it's going to happen and happen consistently, it has to be things that a facilities person or a complex manager can do themselves. And so they're very simple tasks. They're easily trainable, easily teachable to someone. And so that's what we do, is help educate and train so that the owner or the owner's representative can take care of these simple tasks.
And once those things are set, do they change? Does the fire code change often? Is it hard to stay on top of that, or is it's been the same way for years? Doesn't really change. Don't have to worry about it.
The maintenance doesn't really change. It's been pretty much the same for as long as I've been in the business. The codes really impact more what is done, and that really comes into play when a facility is constructed and built. And so, yes, those are updated. Those change as often as every 3 years. But the maintenance and keeping the systems operable, that's remained pretty much the same for a long time.
What are some of the legal ramifications of behind not maintaining a fire safety system properly?
Yeah, many jurisdictions, state and local, have adopted NFPA standards. The National Fire Protection Association, who writes most of the standards and codes related to fire systems, have adopted and mandate formal testing, inspection, maintenance of these systems. And if it's not done, a couple things can happen. One is that the owner's liability or responsibility can become very acute if there's a loss, particularly if there's an injury or a death associated with a fire loss. Secondly, many times the insurance company will point to the owner if there is a property loss and say, well, wait a second, you didn't do or follow the local laws and requirements, and so we may not provide the coverage to the extent that we originally agreed to in your policy. And so there's a real business aspect as well as a legal liability that comes with not maintaining these systems.
Have you seen that in action? Do you have an anecdote, Russell, that where somebody a claim was refused, perhaps because they didn't maintain the systems properly?
If I thought for a moment, I could come up with something specific, but I can tell you that I know it has happened. I have served as an expert in a number of situations where an owner had to defend their position in terms of why something wasn't maintained or something wasn't taken care of. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, this is where, from an owner's point of view, if I can demonstrate the fact that I did everything that I thought I should do, there's really not much more we could expect out of an owner. But as you know, insurance is a business, and they will look for a way to avoid paying particularly a substantial claim if they can demonstrate that an owner was negligent. And so knowledge is a big part of that. If I know that I needed to do something, I need to take care of it.
Well, this is very interesting. So there's a scenario here where perhaps an owner is doing everything they should be doing, but they haven't documented it. They can't prove it. And then the insurance company comes in and says, "Hey, it looks like you've been negligent. Where are your records?" And then what? It's who wins in that scenario?
The record keeping is critical, and we all get lazy about that, personally and in business, and that's why there are forms that can be downloaded, delivered to the owner, whatever, so that they can document these simple things that need to be done. For example, the standard says that I should look at my valves and validate that they're open once a month. And so it's, all I have to do is somewhere have a checklist that, yep, this month I looked at this valve and it was open. It really is simple documentation. And if we do it, it goes a long ways to validating that I did everything that I could do to make sure this system was operable.
So simple, so important, and yet I bet you find a lot of your clients don't do it at all.
No, you're absolutely correct. And look, I understand it. I understand because as we deal with the day-to-day, let's take an apartment complex, and I'm responsible for that apartment complex. And I have this sprinkler system. Remember I said this sprinkler system, for example, just kind of sits there, right, till it's needed. And, so my attention gets focused on the things that impact my tenants, experience. So if the heat isn't working, if I have a water leak, right, or a freeze up, or something like, the electricity has an interruption. Those are the things that I focus on because they're the things that my tenants, experience and create an issue for them. The fact that I have a sprinkler system with a shut valve doesn't impact anything until it matters. And that's one of those old cliches, right? Doesn't matter until it matters. And that's why we tend to not focus there because it's not creating an issue for my tenants.
Doesn't matter until it matters, yes. And then it is everything. We're talking about massive losses, sometimes of life, and which can result in bankruptcy, loss of the property to the owners. I mean, when it happens, it matters in a big way.
That's correct.
So there are forms that folks can download. Is there a best practice with respect to tracking all of that, or is there, I don't know, how do you, what if you were to advise somebody how to keep all that stuff? Are you still putting things in a binder, or are people using electronic methods now to track these things?
Well, one of the things I would suggest to apartment owners is basically Google or go to the yellow pages like we did when I was a young man or whatever, and find yourself a fire protection contractor. It can be fire alarm or fire sprinkler, but you can Google, you can find a contractor, have them come out and look at your property. They can provide the forms. They can also provide a level of service to make sure that your systems are operable that would go beyond what you would do in your normal maintenance. We talked about the laws and requirements. Many jurisdictions, many states in the United States require that my systems, fire alarm, fire sprinkler systems, are examined and inspected and tested by a licensed entity on an annual basis. And these companies will then give you all of the additional records. They're happy to teach you what to do, and many of them, as a service, will maintain those records for you electronically, so that you can have your own paper if you like, but there's also an electronic record maintained by someone for you.
Got it. Let's shift just a little bit. We're talking really specific about the fire systems themselves, but you touched on something earlier I want to expand on, which is you talked about keeping fire exit corridors clear. There's defensible space issues. Can you talk about some of the other non-equipment related best practices that operators should be thinking about to reduce their exposure to fire loss?
Okay, let's talk about probably the most talked about risk exposure right now through the United States, and that is the wildfire situation that is occurring in what we call the wildland urban interface. And regardless of the politics and everything else that are associated, we do know that many areas of the country, of the world, are drier right now. We know that temperatures have risen. When we combine this with a lack of sensible wildland fire management over the last decades, last 100 years, and then we combine that with the fact that we keep moving, right? We want to live where it's beautiful and trees and all those things. We continue to push into the wildland areas with buildings and commercial and residential and stuff. And when we combine all of those together, we see a real definite risk. And there's no one who's looked at the news in the last decade, or whatever, that's not familiar with the fact that we've had huge wildland fires. We've had tremendous loss of property and lives and such. And so when I look at apartments, for example, and we're building apartments and occupying apartments as a part of this wildland urban interface, what can I do to protect my property and my occupants, right, from wildland fire? And understand that, we used to associate wildfire with summer, with heat, the seasonal dry times and such. Now we're seeing wildfires in places that we never expected to have wildfire. We see wildfires occurring during all seasons. You might recall in Colorado in the Front Range, in the Denver area north, we had huge wintertime wildfires that caused tremendous damage. So we need to be on task all the time. And there's some really simple things that a business owner, or let's take our multifamily or apartment managers, can do to mitigate this. And it comes down to simple housekeeping, keeping combustible products, materials, vegetation away from my building. You mentioned the term defensible space. We look at the first 5 feet around a building as critical. And if we keep vegetation, we keep trash, firewood, any other combustibles away from the building in that first 5 feet, it will have a huge positive impact. Most of our destruction that occurs, most of the fires that occur in our facilities, say our apartments, for example, come from embers. We can have a fire that's a mile away, and burning embers can travel that mile through the air and land near our apartment complex or our building and such, and create a fire right there, even though the wildfire itself is still a long ways away from my building. So, when you think about the typical housekeeping things, keeping gutters clean of dead leaves and other material, making sure that 5 feet around my building is clear of dead vegetation. In fact, they recommend no vegetation at all within that 5 feet. That may not be practical or very, right? So look for vegetation, okay, that will stay green. And they actually, for instance, Cal Fire, they actually have vegetation that they recommend if you're going to have vegetation up against your buildings. What are good types of growth to use, and such. So really, that housekeeping aspect is the number one defense, and it is very, very effective in lowering the risk.
That's some great advice. If listeners want to engage Telgian and learn more about what they can do to lower their exposure to fire risk, how do they find you guys?
Well, you can go right to our website, which is www.telgian.com, and there's all of our information about the company and our different services there. They can always email me, and I will pass that along, and I'm rlevitt@telgian.com. So we're, and one thing I will promise, one things that we look at is that we're here to help, we're here to advise, and we are made up of individuals that are committed, and it's not about just making the dollar. There is lots of free information, lots of resources that will direct you to, that will not cost a dime for owners to use and to obtain. If there's more complex things and such, we're happy to engage and help. But I got to tell you, Daniel, so much is out there and available for free. And we want people to have that. We want owners to have that so that they can use that to lower their risk.
Well, you gave some advice today for free that I think people can use immediately. Just the one thing, just check your check your valves, make sure they're open. If we got that message out today, you've done your work.
All right.
Well, it's been great having you here at the Academy. Really appreciate your time, Russell, and sharing some of this wisdom for free. And folks that want to learn more, I hope they do get in touch with you. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Take care. Thank you for joining us at this week's episode of the Apartment Academy podcast. The Apartment Academy is a production of Leonardo 24/7, the industry's leader in multifamily operations and maintenance software. At Apartment Academy, we realize the hard work that goes into property management and the stress that comes along with it. Leonardo 24/7 takes the guesswork out of your team's day-to-day by providing customized daily guidance on tasks that need to be done, guaranteeing consistent operations across your entire portfolio. To learn more, visit www.leonardo247.com today.